the Troponauts. Our mission, to boldly go where everybody is. Until Fife and Boreas, humans thought we knew everything about the troposphere. The chemical composition, the weight, the thickness, something about its movement. But it turns out that in many ways the troposphere is as unknown as the bottom of the sea. The Troponaut base was at Wallops. Now, the way it works was a scientist gets an idea that has to do with remote sensing and a little dab of funding. And he shows up at the hangar with a bunch of parts in the trunk of his car. Now, some of them still have the Radio Shack sticker still attached. Now, he was anxious to get this thing up in the air. And for that, Wallops was the master of the quick and dirty. They could slap together a mount almost entirely made out of 4-inch aluminum angle that usually weighed 800 pounds and was the size of a Buick. For a power supply, for the first try, we just tapped into this overhead light here. Now, if it was a good idea, and it would eventually end up the size of a tennis ball in a satellite, but you got to start somewhere. Now, a helicopter makes perfect sense for a new experiment. Since they aren't that aerodynamic in the first place, you don't need special ports or apertures. You can just bolt it onto the outside. And other aerial platforms, which I won't mention, airplanes, you have to zoom by your target, grab in what you can, and then you swing way wide around and you zoom by again, hoping you got what you wanted. Now, there is nothing like just stopping in the air and hitting a target about 50 times in a row to get a good data set. You'll have to agree with that. Now, that's how Charlie Wallfall's apparatus got mounted in the helicopter. First, it was bolted onto the gun mounts in the nose, then it got fancier. And the new receiver had to be below the skids, but retractable for landing. Something hydraulic would be an engineering nightmare and expensive, and something electrical would have to have backup systems for safety and would overload the aircraft generator in the second place. And at some point, somebody looks across the hangar floor and spied a hand-cranked, cable-operated forklift. Solid steel, 900-pound capacity for an 85-pound instrument. It was a miracle. It was bolted on the side of the helicopter and we were in business. Turns out Charlie's idea was pretty good, so the whole thing was pretty fancy by the time we finished Boreas. Piers isn't here, is he? Okay, good. I'm going to say some things about space that come from my own understanding, so they may be flawed. And I was going to say it was a real pain to have an actual astronaut that had been there and sitting in front of him, but since he's not here, it's a relief. Anyway, experiments in space are such a piece of cake. Anyway, what's the weather report going to be like in space? Dark, clear, cold, wind, calm. Light, clear, cold, wind, calm. If there's a problem, you dump a couple of bushels of numbers into a computer, and a little rocket motor somewhere goes for about 2 seconds. Problem solved. Not so on the Kansa Prairie. Radiation sensors needed clear skies, and all the experiments had to work simultaneously for uniform data. So hours were spent watching a cirrus cloud 75 miles away as the satellite overpass time came near. Body English was used, incense was burned, chanting dances were performed. With 7 or 8 aircraft based at different places, and a crowd on the ground to coordinate, it was mostly like using voodoo to herd cats. So anyway, by the second Fife session, some enthusiasm was building. It seemed that not only could this multidisciplinary full-court press actually work, but some pretty exciting discoveries were coming together. Heady stuff. Just about exciting was the massé shot a mechanic Smitty made in a pool game in Manhattan against a C-130 crew from Maine. First real one I actually ever saw. The cue ball was airborne for at least 1.5 feet, 9 ball in the corner pocket. demoralized our opponent. And just as I was beginning to understand the radiation and flux worlds, Prasad Gogolini showed up with a microwave thingy. He had two sensors screwed down on a piece of pine 2x4 and wanted to tie it to Charlie's mount on the nose. In the holy name of airworthiness, we found a piece of 4-inch aluminum angle and we were good to go. 100 feet off the deck, down in the funnest part of the troposphere, where the air has rocks and trees and towers and wires in it, and where the winds and clouds might block the radiation and diddle with the flux, but the microwaves were there by the thousands. We shared the Kansa airspace with a group of safe professional pilots. Now, operations were planned so that standard lateral and vertical separation was maintained, but still, weather, maintenance issues, science crew wishes, and a 15-kilometer square area made heads-up flying necessary. But if you know the other guy and trust his judgment, and you're talking to each other, a miss is as good as a mile. I think at least once while we were at a high hover, the boys in the back saw a twin otter zip across their monitor screen caught by a nadir-pointing camera. You can see the urgency of studying the boreal forest by looking at a Google Earth depiction of the area around Prince Albert in Saskatchewan. You can see a virus-like growth creeping up like a rash into the southern border of the forest. It has a crystalline appearance like it's made of tiny pixels. It's humans. And humans like to lay out their property borders with straight lines and square corners. Now, north of this infection, it was good for the soul to see a place where everything is where it wants to be. Vegetation matches soil types and sun exposure and moisture content, and it was amazing to find out that this whole community of organisms acted like a single living thing during seasonal changes in temperature and moisture. Now, getting to Prince Albert was like a 50s road trip, cruising along at the speed and altitude of a migrating goose. No aircraft, no air conditioning, no AC, so the windows were down, elbows out in the breeze. It took a week to get there from Wallace. We stopped at mom and pop airports where you could land right next to the pump, fill up, grab a cheeseburger, and hit the road again. The old Smitty, my mechanic, was a promoter. An engine chip light caused us to land in a field in Wisconsin. Now, Smitty went foraging, and before I could get the cowling off, he was back with the farmer, had the tool we needed, a tractor with a lift platform to work from, a glass of iced tea apiece, and an invitation to lunch. And our base at Candle Lake was a helicopter pilot's dream. A snowmobile lodge deep in the wilderness with a helipad in a clearing 50 yards from our rooms. No tarmac, no control tower, no noise other than the occasional boom of a fuel drum expanding in the sun. The only downside was that Smitty caught a bigger fish than I did, and he never stopped talking about it. The science had gotten more complex and the task more ambitious, and the study area was exponentially bigger. But we were exploring areas of knowledge that were uncharted. It was a long flight from Candle Lake to the northern area at Thompson, and it was clear that this boreal band was such a big player in global climate, and people needed to know it was a lot more than just raw material for boards and paper. Now, another notable difference between the boreal forest and the Kansa prairie was a skimpy number of places to land the helicopter during data flights for a bathroom break. What I and the rest of the world found out in Fife and Boreas was that the troposphere isn't just a layer of gas, it's earth breath, a complex product of the planet and all the creatures on it. And whether we're looking at it from a satellite or from our front yard, we now see it with new eyes. Now, I look forward to every day of working with old Charlie Walthall, because Charlie was a cool hand. The only way you could tell he wanted to kill somebody was that his eyes would get big. And as time passes, I am even more in awe of Forrest Hall and Pierre Sellers for pulling this thing off. Now, as scientists, leaders, and regular old good guys, they made their mark. Thank you.